Um, and we will get started. My name is Sonia Starr, and I am the Policy Director at Housing Alliance Delaware, and I'm really excited for today's webinar. You are in a treat. Marisol is one of the most amazing speakers I've heard in a while, and she's really incredibly informative, intelligent, and interactive. You can't ask for anything better. But before we get to her speaking, I'm going to ask you to bear with me for just a few minutes as I try to give you a little bit of the context of why we're having this webinar at this particular moment in Delaware's time, because it is extremely timely. Right now in our legislature is an incredibly important bill, HB 135, the Devorah Gilbert White's Homeless Bill of Rights. And it is really having a hard struggle. It is very hard to get people who aren't considered our base to understand and support this bill. So, how we talk about this bill, how we talk about people experiencing homelessness matters. And that's what this webinar is all about. How can we utilize data on how people hear our talk in a way that will allow us to be successful in our goals? So just real quickly about the bill, go ahead to the next slide, Rachel. This bill focuses on long-term effective data-driven solutions. It will incentivize local governments to focus on long-term fixes by creating more affordable housing and emergency rental assistance programs, establishing a local homeless service office, expand mental health and substance abuse programs, establish public bathrooms and showers, and allow for people to live in a sanitary place that doesn't target their personal belongings, all of which we need in order to start to even begin to address the needs of people who are living on the streets. Keep going. In Delaware, we have seen an uptick of local legislation that targets people experiencing homelessness. We've seen this most recently in Dover and Wilmington, but anybody on the call from Georgetown, who I apologize if you listen to read the Facebook posts, some of them are really scary. So we have to find a way to communicate with the public that really supports our clients, our neighbors, the people who live with us in Delaware. Is there one more? Yeah. So why this webinar is so crucial now? Crucial now? It gives us the language to communicate with more people. It teaches us how to mobilize advocates to action, and it uses national, state, and local narrative research to get a pulse on public perceptions about housing issues and solutions to the homelessness crisis. So who is Marisol Bayo? I feel like that's like a mythical question out there. I was introduced to her at the National Low Income Housing Coalition when I first had the privilege of hearing her speak. She'll tell you more about all of the amazing things she's done, but she has used storytelling in its many different forms as a journalist, as a researcher, as a way to communicate with people effectively. Um, and I just want to tell really quickly one quick story that I think about often when I think about this story of why stories matter, and then I'll pass it on to you. Many of you on this call know my previous life. I was a congregational rabbi. I was at a conference with a colleague early on who was an assistant rabbi. She was telling me she had just given this, hell and brimstone sermon on high holidays, maximum amount of visibility, told everybody how they were living the sinful life, everything wrong that they were doing. And they were doing an aftermath with their senior afterwards in his office. And he was saying to her, I've been getting a lot of calls about that sermon. And her response was, well, what was wrong with it? Did I say anything that wasn't true? And he said, let me stop you for a second. He said, what was your goal in giving that sermon? And she said, to change people's minds, to get them to act differently. And he said, how's that working for you? It wasn't about whether her story was true or what she said was true. It was about the fact that she wasn't communicating to people in a way that they could hear her and she could get her goal. That's what today's about in a different venue. Today's about how can we use language effectively to communicate to others in a way they can hear us to reach our goals. So Marisol, it is an honor and privilege to have you, and I turn it over to you.
Super. Thank you, Sonia and Rachel. First, what a lovely introduction. Sonia, I think I'm going to take you with me on the road so you can introduce me every single time because that was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I appreciate it. And I loved how you were talking about today's conversation and webinar. You know, I was on a call last week with someone in California. And we were talking about this very thing and the fact that when we are telling our stories, it's actually about the receiver, not the giver, right? And so today is going to be all about that. So my name is Marisol Bello. I'm the executive director of the Housing Narrative Lab, and we are a national organization that works to build support for all of the housing solutions that make our communities safe, healthy, and vibrant. And today on the webinar with me is also my colleague Dustin Valdez, who is going to be the person in the chair. He'll be navigating all of our Zoom conversations and all of that. So to kick us off, I am going to share a deck and I'm gonna, can y'all give me a thumbs up if you see it on the screen? Beautiful. All right. And so as I start, I want to note, please, super, thank you so much. As we're going through this, if you have questions, all the things, please put them in the chat so that we can make sure at the end we address all of the questions that you all may have. Again, the Housing Narrative Lab, we focus on narrative research, training and education, strategic storytelling, and really building the coalitions and collaborations that we need in order to share our stories far and wide about why we need housing, housing solutions, why we need the kinds of policy, public policy, and public investment that really make our communities and our neighborhoods the kinds of places where we want to live and grow and raise our families. So, our goals for today are fourfold. One is we're going to talk about narrative. What is narrative and why it matters? We're going to talk about the housing narrative research that the lab has done over the last 5 years. We have a library, a wealth of narrative research that helps us really understand the values and the feelings and the thinking that the public at large has about housing and housing solutions and homelessness. We're going to talk about who our audiences are, right? Sonia alluded to that earlier. And then we're going to talk about what all of that means for the kind of roadmap that we are creating as we are telling our stories. So we're going to talk about what we call the narrative roadmap, right? The kind of tools that you can use as you go forward into your day and really are thinking about how am I telling a better and stronger story? So let's kick off. First, when you think of the word narrative, right? When you hear the word narrative, tell me what comes up. What imagery or feelings? Maybe put a few in the chat, right? What are some of the words and thinking that comes up for you? What are the images? What feelings? Okay? Just off the bat, just kind of a visceral, what do you think of when you think of the word narrative? And you can put it in the chat. Words, story, people. Love that. Personal stories. Yes. Yeah. The backdrop. Oh, Cynthia, who controls it? He who controls the narrative has the power. Love that. Perspective. Yes. These are great. Using concepts to explain and contextualize issues. I love that. That's fabulous. These are great. Keep them coming in the chat. Wonderful. Yeah. So all of that, right? And narratives are, it's the big story, right? It's that collection of stories that shape our perceptions, right? That shape how we think, how we feel, how we act about everything and anything. Narratives are shape how we are with our families. They shape our viewpoints on issues. They shape everything, right? And narratives are everywhere in the world. They are conveyed at the dinner table, in our politics, in our policy, in our news media. Every time you turn on the news, every TV channel you open or show that you stream at church. right? Sonia talked about this when in her introduction, right? At church, in the pews, at the barbecue. Narratives are everywhere. And narratives they define who we are. They define what we believe. They define how we act. Everything that we say and do is based on the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we see and hear from other people, the stories we see in the media or in pop culture. That means that narratives, because they are everywhere, right? They are in everything we hear, see, say, do. They permeate through scale, consistency, and repetition. Scale, everyone, everywhere, right? Consistency and repetition, constantly and all the time. That's how narratives form. And so narratives keep forming until they define who we are and what we believe, right? They define our stories. They become part of our everyday lexicon. They become a part of who we are until they actually just eventually become part of the public attitude. I want you to think about, right, how smoking, think about the narratives around smoking, how we went from people were smoking on TV, in front of their kids, in every public building in America. And little by little, the narrative around that started to change, right? With research that doctors and public health professionals did. Eventually, TV started showing people who smoked as not very cool people. And eventually, right, what happened? After all of the public started to shift and change how they started to see smoking, it changed policy, right? Nobody smokes in public buildings anymore. They don't smoke in bars. So that's narrative change in action. And we've seen it with so many things, right? Seatbelts is another example. The civil rights movement. I mean, there are so many examples in our lifetime where we've seen narratives shift and change and move. And narratives really matter. They matter because people act based on what they believe and what they feel. I know that we, as policy folks and as advocates, we want people to move based on the facts, except that the facts are not what changes people's minds. The facts are not what actually move people to take action. It's the feeling that they have or the belief that they hold that then actually moves them to take an action or to think something. So it's actually when we talk about changing hearts and minds, what we're really doing is changing the heart first, because the heart is what's going to change the minds. And so how are we talking to people to connect with them at that level? Because the reality is that people will they'll support solutions based on what they believe the problem is. And so if they believe that the problem is that people make personal choices to live outside, they will support solutions that says round them up and put them in jail. But if they understand, right, if they are feeling like, wait a minute, people are working really hard and there are some systems out here, they're not getting paid enough to afford rent. People can't actually access the health care. If they start to feel that, right, whether it's themselves or people that they know and see, and they start to then feel that, it starts to translate into an understanding that broken systems are actually forcing people into homelessness, and housing solutions like the ones that we support, i.e., providing people housing and the support services they need, that starts to make a little more sense to them, right? So we have to get people to first feel and understand some of these pieces. Sorry, excuse me. We need folks to first feel these pieces before they can understand it. So, how do the research findings help us to get to exactly that? I'm gonna sum up 5 years worth of housing research into 6 key findings. Okay. And again, just as a reminder, as we're going through it, please clarifying questions, any questions that come up for you, put them in the chat. Rachel's going to keep tabs of them for us as we go through this. So I talked about changing hearts and minds. We have to get to how people are feeling. Finding number one is that most Americans have a personal connection to the housing crisis. Most Americans, right? So 2 out of 3 people have a personal connection to housing instability. That means that 2 out of 3 people either are experiencing housing instability in their lives or they see or know someone who is. Most of those folks are young adults, Black folks, Black and brown folks, adults who live in urban communities, folks who are non-college educated, renters, folks that are low income people. Maybe whoever is there, maybe you can just make sure that you put yourselves on mute. Thank you so much. Folks who are considered low income and parents as well. And so 2 out of 3 people have a personal connection to housing instability. This is really going to become important when we talk about the narrative roadmap. 3 out of 5 people have a personal connection to homelessness. Again, many of the similar groups that I mentioned earlier, Black and brown folks, young people. Actually, in this case, we're seeing a lot of folks who live in rural communities, right? So um, some big shifts there as well, right? African Americans are feeling that personal connection to homelessness. Finding number 2 is that we are seeing a significant shift toward recognizing systemic root causes. Guess what? If you know that you are working so hard, or your neighbor or your friends are struggling and working hard and you still can't make rent, you start to think, wait, we're not choosing to be in these positions. We're actually not making enough money to be able to afford rent. Or we had a health scare, or I lost my job, right? And so people are starting to make a connection based on the things that they are seeing and feeling and recognizing that, wait, we've got some really jacked up systems in place right now that are not letting us move along. So our research has found that 3 out of 5 people blame systemic causes for housing insecurity and homelessness. And I will tell you that that's a really key thing because when we did similar research, this was based on some research we did last fall. When we asked that same question 3 years ago, we actually found that less than half of the respondents believed that systemic and economic factors caused homelessness. So we saw that number in 3 years go from 49% who understood that broken systems, those economic factors, were the root cause of homelessness. We went from 49% to 60 something percent just last fall. So in 3 years, we are seeing some really big shifts in how people are starting to connect the problems with housing to the problems with the outcomes, and the outcome being obviously people losing their homes or getting evicted. Finding number 3, I will say what we face is a cynicism problem about whether our solutions will work. So we are seeing, people get it, they're feeling it, they're seeing it in their lives, they're seeing it in the people that they know. And they're recognizing that there are some broken systems in place, but we're facing a cynicism problem. It's not a compassion problem. It's not a like, yes, your solutions don't make sense to us. It's yes, but will your solution work? Right? So they support the idea, for example, that housing and services will solve homelessness, but they're not so sure if it's going to work in practice, right? And the reason for that is because they worry about fraud, waste, and abuse. And I will say that the number one reason, or the respondents were given a list of reasons for why they would oppose housing and services as a common sense solution to homelessness. And the top reasons were abuse in the system, fear of tax increases, right? Our hard-earned dollars being wasted. And we saw this across the board, including with Black and brown folks. And then just how efficient it was, right? How much are we spending for the return on investment? We had a majority of adults who agreed, and again, this was kind of across the board. They agreed with this idea that because all of our families are struggling, we shouldn't spend more of our hard-earned tax dollars on programs that only help certain people. So we're facing a little of the tension, not about that we need to do something, but about how we do it and whether the how that we are proposing is actually going to work. And as a result of that, it means that the opposition's messages about criminalization, about arresting and fining people, actually has some traction, right? Having said that, it has traction, but not overwhelming support. Because finding number 4 finds that there is bipartisan rejection of punitive policies and practices. So we see, for example, that a pretty overwhelming majority of people, was something like 72%, reject the idea of ticketing, jailing, and fining folks who are homeless as a solution to homelessness. Another majority understand that policing, ticketing, and finding people further marginalizes people who are experiencing homelessness, and that in fact it actually ends up making the problem worse. And this is good news for all of you that are working on the various things that you are working on. We also find that people will support candidates and support elected leaders who want long-term solutions and they won't support those candidates who want to jail and ticket if another candidate has a long-term solution like housing and supportive services that we know are long-term and will do this for the long haul. And so we are finding, contrary to what it actually feels like right now in the public, we are finding that people just approach this. This is a common sense thing for folks. They get this. And the challenge for us when we get to the narrative roadmap, and we'll talk more about, is how do we talk about it in a way that lifts up all of these pieces, right? Because they're there with us. Again, they're there with us. Number 5, they reject punitive, and number 4 is they reject punitive policies and they support overwhelmingly concrete, tangible solutions for homelessness. We have more support than we think or that we give credit to. Because in multiple surveys, people overwhelmingly support housing plus services as a solution to homelessness. Like that's just a clear high baseline of support. And a lot of support for the government's role in helping to solve homelessness. Like there, again, really baseline to high levels of support that we need to capitalize on. And number 6 that this points to is that we can change people's minds. This is why we're so excited to talk about these issues all the time and have these kinds of conversations with you all. We found that the percentage of people who said it was more important to prioritize funding and housing and support services grew after they heard our messages. So in our surveys, we asked people, what do you think about this? And then at the end, we ask them again. And we see that after they hear our messages, they actually are like, yes, that makes sense. And they support increased government policies that focus on housing and solutions, housing and services, and or other solutions, because I know I keep pointing there, but it's a myriad, right? They support rental assistance and or vouchers, right? Depending on the language that you use. They support repurposing empty buildings. We'll talk more about some of these tangible solutions in a moment. Secondly, we see, right, that sustained communications will increase public support and public concern about these issues. To also very clear, that our messages just need to reach more people. They need to reach more people. So we're going to talk about audiences in a moment, but let's go to a poll. So I shared 6 key findings with you. 1, more Americans are having personal connections to housing instability or homelessness. More Americans understand the real root causes of housing instability and homelessness. More Americans are that we face a cynicism problem when we find opposition. 4, that more Americans reject punitive policies and actions. 5 is an overwhelming support for tangible solutions. And 6, we can change people's minds. What finding do you find most surprising? So Dustin is going to launch a poll for us. Dustin, do you need me to stop the share in order to launch the poll?
No, everybody should see it now.
All right, let's take the poll and see. Dustin, let us know when we've gotten a good critical mass. And actually, this poll says question 1 and 2, but you're really just answering one. Which finding was most surprising to you? Can you all get into the poll?
Yep, we're about 62% of participants.
Great. All right. We'll get a few more responses. Maybe when we get to the 3/4 mark. Anyone else? Just have one question. I am seeing that this poll has a series of questions, but it really is just the one question. Which finding was most surprising? All right, Dustin, you want to give us the results? All right. So something like 29% say that most Americans reject punitive policies and actions was the most surprising. Would anyone who voted for that one want to get off mute for a moment and just talk a little bit about why you thought that was surprising?
I will,
Yeah.
because of the prevalence all around of people seemingly supporting the anti-loitering ordinances, don't panhandle ordinances, the cleanups of the encampments. It just seems odd that the surveys respond something differently than what we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that, Michael. Thank you. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, right? Because those feel to folks like easy solutions, and the cynicism problem that I talked about gets in the way, right? And so that's why some of the opposition's policies, or the other side's policies, I should say, have some traction for the very reasons that we were talking about in terms of the cynicism, and frankly, just how we are framing and how they are framing a lot of these issues. So thank you. Anyone else who'd maybe want to add anything to that, or others? I know I saw 26% say that 26% found it surprising that more Americans are understanding the real root causes of housing instability and homelessness. Anyone who maybe voted for that one would like to jump in terms of why that one stuck out for you? Anyone?
Here's all I can.
Yeah, please. Thank you, Sonia.
Because we often go to public hearings, and because of who shows up at public hearings, we don't see what most Americans believe. We see what most Americans who come to public hearings believe. But it's easy to get that mixed up in your own head.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate that, right? Because they have, right, the folks that come out are a very activated group of people. And a lot of the work and loud, and a lot of the work that we have to do is activate our group and our audiences to do some of this work and stand with us as well, particularly those that can be so disengaged. So I appreciate that actually. It's a great segue into our um third uh, section that I'd love for us to talk about. Actually, is a little bit about who are our audiences, right? And y'all can still see the deck, right? Yes? Okay, super. All right. So who are our audiences? Through the work that we've done, we've been able to identify 4 key audiences and the kinds of who they are, what makes up the audience, and how to talk to them. So the first is the insiders. The insiders are us, the almost 50-something people on this call, and all of our volunteers and our donors and our advocates and our policymakers and our service providers and advocates and nonprofit developers. We are the insiders. We are high levels of support and action, right? We respond to messages about justice and equity and housing as a human right. We are the folks who need to spread the messages far and wide, right? And share effective messages far and wide. We need to be the giver of the messages so that our receivers are hearing what we are saying. So that means that we need to give in a way that the receiver will receive it and hear what we are saying. To the great example that Sonia gave us early on when we first did the introduction. We are the insiders. We are not our target audiences for most messages, right? We are not our target audiences for most messages. However, we need us and the people we work with to amplify our messages so that we can reach other audiences, including and especially the next two audiences that I'm going to identify. The first is the base. These are the folks that we want to mobilize to action. And these folks are made up of generally adults under 30, people who live in cities, generally people that live out west. They are more likely to be Black and brown, renters, identifying as Democrats or liberal. And this last part is interesting. In our research that we did last year, this fall, we found that the majority of people with no children under under the age of 18 living at home were actually one of the primary audiences. But we found in research from a couple years back that parents with children, regardless, actually also made up these audiences. And unsurprisingly, high rates of folks with direct and indirect experiences with housing instability and homelessness, right? So a lot of renters, for example, over homeowners. How to talk with them. They respond to messages about people living with dignity. They respond to messages about systemic change. And they respond to messages about the reality of the crisis. We live in a crisis and we need to shift the crisis, all of us together. They respond to community, all of us joining together. So our base are the people that we want to mobilize to action. That group of people that we want to go to City Hall, that's this group. We need more. This is a group we want to mobilize to action. So we need to talk with them in a way that will mobilize them to a place where they're going to say, yes, we care about this thing, and yes, we will show up. The second big audience that we need to work with is persuadables. These are the people who we want to move to support. What I will tell you about persuadables is they actually believe two things at the same time. They believe that housing is a basic need. And they believe that if you don't have it, it is a personal responsibility or a personal decision, personal choices that you've made that have left you, for example, without a roof over your head. Persuadables are politically diverse, right? So they actually are identify as Democrat, liberal, progressive. They identify as conservative and Republican. They identify as independent. There are significant numbers of Latina folks in this particular group. They are also more likely to be lower income and the least likely to identify as voters this year. They are a balanced mix of homeowners and renters. Renters maybe tip a little bit higher, but they're a pretty balanced mix. So this is the group that is representative of the general public, right? So they have kind of equal parts of a lot of different groups. So how to talk to them. This group does not respond to partisan language or appeals. The base does. The persuadables, they don't respond to partisan language or appeals. For them, language that focuses on security and stability, right? So the security and stability pieces that homeowners really care about, right? The homeowners that are persuadables, they respond to that kind of language. The renters that identify as persuadables, they respond to affordability, right? So, and we're actually finding affordability cuts across the board, to be perfectly frank, right? So this is a group you want to, when we are talking about our solutions, we are talking about this is smart spending. This is common sense. This is about the community benefits, right? This, we know, let me show you. We know this works, and let me show you why and how, right? These are the folks that want that real tangible thing. The last audience is the least persuadable. In some cases, we call them our opposition. In other cases, we're just going to call them the least persuadable. These are the folks that really they are the least likely to be persuaded because they fundamentally have opposing views about how to solve homelessness. They think it's a private responsibility that you have to handle for yourself. They don't think that government has a role except in jailing or fining people or other punitive policies, right? This is a group that believes that people of color who don't get ahead are really responsible for their own condition, and they just don't see a role for government. And this group is more likely than not to be concerned that people are going to take advantage of supportive housing, for example, or other kinds of government resources, and that people will take advantage of those government resources who don't, quote unquote, deserve them. So they just fundamentally do not believe, right? They just sit in a different place. So this is actually a group of people that are the least likely to be persuaded. And what you really want to do here is to neutralize their opposition. You want to limit how excited or angry or volatile they get to show up at the exact kind of hearing that Sonia talked about a little while ago, right? So this group leans male, more often than not 65, majority white. They identify as Republican conservative. They are more likely to have higher incomes, and they are more likely to be homeowners. This group, you need to focus with them on pragmatic efficiency, fiscal responsibility, talking about shifting resources to what works. And actually, I'm going to talk more about that language of shifting resources to what works because it also works for persuadables. This actually also very interesting, that personal stories that show how housing and services get people on a path to self-sufficiency can also work with this particular group. So let's take another poll before we get into the narrative roadmap. Which audience do you currently work with the most? Justin, please launch the poll. So do you work with insiders most? Do you work with the base most? Do you work with persuadables or opposition? Insiders, they are us. Very active, highly engaged. They are the people doing the work. Our base, maybe more inactive, and we need to mobilize them to support. Persuadables, we need to get them to join our side. And then the opposition, again, is those least persuadable groups of people. Who do you work with? And Dustin, we get to about 3/4, 75%. Why don't you share the results with us? Why don't you let us know who are the audiences that you currently work with? How's it looking, Dustin?
Almost there, 66%.
All right, let's get a few more folks letting us know who your audiences are. Who do you work with? Are you working with insiders, the base, persuadables, opposition? Insiders, again, folks in our field, the folks that are actively engaged. The base are the folks we want to bring in, right? They're in our community. They believe what we believe, but haven't really yet engaged the way we need them to. Persuadables, believe a little this, a little that. They can come to our side, but we can also lose them to the other side. And then the opposition, right? They're the folks that we're not going to invite to the barbecue because they're least likely to do so, to join. All right. Insiders, overwhelmingly. All right. Okay, and then 6% work with persuadables and 6% with opposition and 26% with the base. I am curious for folks who said they work with opposition or persuadables. Actually, even the base. Maybe can you come off mute? Can somebody who said base, persuadables, or opposition come off mute and let us know what you are seeing, thinking, and feeling as you're working with these audiences? Love to hear a little bit more from you. Yeah, did somebody go off mute?
Okay, I know many of you, you're not this shy. She's very nice. She's not going to say anything you said is wrong. So somebody come on off mute before I start calling.
I selected Persuadables because I have in the past talked with, certainly I am sort of an insider or in the base. I'm not sure I can't separate those two, but Persuadables to me are the people that I um talk to because um that there's at least a possibility of moving forward. So I think they are well worth discussing it with because they could go either way.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Great. Thank you, Kathleen. I'm curious when you talk with them, how do you talk with them differently than you would talk, let's say, to an insider or a person in the base or somebody that's kind of with you?
I do find that sharing narratives to be particularly helpful because people don't really think of people tend to think of homelessness as, just one big giant mess, which it's not. There's different silos. And letting helping people understand that there are very different people who are homeless for very specific reasons that maybe aren't really something they can do anything about.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Thank you, Kathleen. It's really helpful. All right. Super. Anyone else? To Sonia's point, it sounds like y'all can be a chatty group. Anybody else want to join? All right. Then we will go to the next piece. We're going to talk a little bit about, and actually this is, we're going to talk a little bit about the housing narrative roadmap. Right. So Kathleen talked a little bit about how stories are really effective when she's talking to persuadables. And so we're going to dig in a little bit more into some of the ways that we can connect with different audiences as we are making our case, right? So the first is to lead with shared values, right? The most effective messages contain shared values that the majority of people will resonate with, right? So shared values are things that convey those ideas. And somebody mentioned this early on about narratives conveying ideas. Shared values convey simple ideas like family, freedom, security, fairness, our community, right? Belonging, wellness. Those are often top tested value statements that really receive strong agreement from base and persuadables. And actually, when we focus on things like values, it moves our conversations away from the political divisiveness to we all care about this thing, right? So it moves us from it's not a them problem, it's an us problem. So feelings of so values of safety, stability, community, health, love, right? Really, we saw this with marriage equality, right? We saw that once the conversation shifted to instead of a legalese conversation, but it shifted to love. That shouldn't we love who we want to love? We started to have a whole different conversation, right? Because now we went away from the politics into this value that we all really want for ourselves and for our families, right? So key messages like no matter our race, gender, or income, we all want to get and keep a roof over our head. Again, it shifts the debate from political to community-wide. The second, we talked about how more people are recognizing systemic causes with one of the key findings. So we want to name systemic and economic root causes, not by saying economic and systemic root causes, but really explicitly naming things like high rents, flat wages that are not keeping up with the rents, things like um, trauma or healthcare, people having to choose between, having healthcare or being able to pay rent, right? So really effective messages that link housing instability to structural failures, but in a very tangible way, right? So actually naming some of those root causes in ways that people are going to get and understand. The third is proposing tangible solutions, right? Folks need to be convinced that our solutions work. So when we say things like more housing, it's not as persuasive for folks as saying something like shifting resources to repurpose empty buildings, or shifting resources for more rental assistance or vouchers, or shifting resources to protect renters, right? They feel tangible to people. Shifting resources for housing and the support services that people need to get off the street and rebuild their lives. So I also mentioned that idea of shifting resources it actually speaks to persuadables and the opposition really, really well. It frankly also speaks to the base because it makes people understand that we're not talking about putting a whole bunch of new money. We have so much investment and funding. We need to spend it smartly and wisely. And that's why we're going to shift resources for more housing and supportive services that get people off the streets or break the cycle of homelessness and help them to rebuild their lives, right? Or any of the other solutions that so many of us are working toward, including vouchers and eviction prevention. Telling stories. Kathleen mentioned she talks a lot to persuadables. She talks to a lot of persuadables, and stories matter, right? Messages that tell the story of people are among the most persuasive tools that we have in our toolbox. Messages where people tell their stories from an asset frame are more powerful than someone who talks about their stories from a place of trauma. So humanizing the issue that shows how anyone can face a rough patch because of a job loss or a medical emergency. Those are the systemic problems we talked about earlier, right? So what does that look like? Focusing on the positive impact of housing on the person or the community rather than focusing on their trauma. This is called asset framing. And asset framing means stating their best before the rest. Too often we tell these personal stories or we tell these lived experience stories from a place of trauma or the person as a problem. We do this inadvertently, and we actually cement the idea that the person is a problem that needs to be fixed. Versus, right, telling their best before their rest. When they had housing, they were able to get off the street, and it meant they could go back to school. It meant that they could get the mental health care that they needed and the medicine they needed to be able to hold a job or to go back to school or to be able to parent their children. Right? Those were all asset framing. It meant that the children who were homeless had a stable place where they could study and, I don't know, get the part in the school play. Right? We need to tell those stories more. Talk about how providing that second chance allows you to rebuild your life. Explicitly rejecting punitive measures and policies, right? We talked about how people do reject those punitive measures. And so we are going to suggest how shifting resources from expensive and inefficient punitive measures toward compassionate, proven solutions. And then we can name our solutions because many of you are working on a variety of solutions, including some of the pieces that Sonia mentioned early on, right, in the call today or on our webinar today. And then the last one is really talking about or is really using language that builds trust, plain language. I know we are often, because we know the housing policies and budgets and all of the acronyms and what they mean and the terminology, We are often the smartest people in the room when it comes to the ins and outs of housing. But that's very difficult to use that kind of terminology when we are talking to folks that we want to persuade or mobilize and activate. This is where talking to them in plain ways that really speaks to how they feel about an issue becomes really important. When we talk to folks in a wonky, policy heavy way, we're not going to connect with them. We're trying to connect with the part of their brain that hasn't been activated yet, right? Because we need to connect first with their heart in order to then activate the brain. And too often we first go to the brain and not the heart first. And part of that is the language that we use, right? The kind of nuance in the language that we use, because small shifts in terminology can significantly shift and reduce resistance that people have in how we are in our solutions. So it's things like saying housing people can afford, having a safe place to live, or keeping a roof over their heads, right? Just small shifts like that can build public confidence in housing programs because it really notes to, it's plain speaking, right? We all want a roof over our head. We all want a safe place to live so that we can live our best lives. Small shifts, things like stable housing over permanent supportive housing. We use permanent supportive housing a lot because that's actually the name of the program. And yet it can be unhelpful because when people think about permanent, right, there's this piece about using stable housing or supportive housing as long as they need it instead of permanent supportive housing, which can evoke a sense of the indefinite and gets to that, triggers that feeling that we talked about earlier about abuse and ineffectiveness and fraud. Permanent can trigger some of that. But when we talk about people getting the housing that they need, as long as they need it, and the supportive services that they need to break the cycle of homelessness or get off the streets, that then starts to connect in a different kind of way with folks. Lastly, another example of that is arresting and fining folks, right? Arresting and fining or arresting and ticketing people will make homelessness worse versus let's not criminalize people. There's a more visceral understanding that people have when we say arresting and ticketing. Doesn't solve arresting and ticketing, folks, is just going to make homelessness worse, right? That's a very visceral thing. People get that and they understand it. Criminalizing actually does more harm than good because there's so much of a dominant, harmful narrative that people that are experiencing homelessness are on drugs and using illegal drugs, that when we say don't criminalize people, they don't get what we are saying. They're actually thinking through this frame of illegal drug use. And so we're tripping ourselves up. So we actually need to be able to say arresting and ticketing people who are experiencing homelessness, that's just going to make homelessness worse. It's just going to make homelessness worse. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the problem with not, right? So I'm going to say to you all, I'm going to use an example right now. I'm going to say to you all, I do not do this. I do not want you to think about a pink porcelain elephant in a tutu on your desk. Do not think of a pink porcelain elephant on your desk because that's zany. That is a zany decoration to have on your desk, so don't even think about it. I am going to guess, going out on a limb, that many of you on this call right now had in some fashion a visualization of a pink porcelain elephant in a tutu on your desk. In some fashion. Even though I asked you, please don't. And the reason is, it's just the way our brains work, right? Our brains see or hear what's around the not. And the negation ends up just repeating and reinforcing some other frame. Often the opposition's frame or misinformation or a lie or disinformation in some fashion. And what people recall or what people envision or people see isn't the not. It's actually the pieces around the knot. So a good example of this is We say this all the time. Homelessness is not a choice. So given what I just shared with you, what do y'all think people are thinking? Right? They're not going to hear the not. What they're hearing is homelessness, choice, and they're connecting inadvertently to things that we actually don't want them to connect. And so the way to change that is to reframe it. People are forced into homelessness when they can't afford the rent, systemic problem. They lose a job, also systemic, or they suffer a trauma or health emergency. Lots of systemic reasons there that we are naming in plain language. People are forced into homelessness when they can't afford rent, or they lose a job, or they suffer a trauma or health emergency. We are reframing and we're not repeating the opposition's frame. So let's pause here for a moment. Actually, I'm going to just pause before we go into small group breakouts because I'd like us to have a little bit more of that. I'm going to stop the share for a minute. And questions. What kinds of questions do folks have based on this conversation? We did a little polls. We gave you some 4 areas. Maybe Rachel, do you want to jump in with questions folks have?
Yeah, we had a couple of things in the chat. Someone asked, Mike asked, how do we get local electeds to understand that most people are, in the context of when he asked that question, was to understand that most people don't support fining and arresting and, like, even though I'm not supposed to say it, criminalization measures. How do we get local electeds to get this? Which might be kind of a inherent, like, do more of what you're going to teach us to do today. But I wanted to bring that to your attention.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think you cite some evidence, right? I mean, there's actually quite a considerable amount, certainly the Housing Narrative Labs research, and there have been other pieces of research where you can talk about polls where people are concerned about the cost of affordability, where they are concerned that they won't be able to actually afford rent and might end up on the street, right? And we're seeing that not just through organizations like the lab, but some of the affordability polls are coming actually through some news media and also through academics like Harvard has done a lot of research about how there's, more than half of the households in America are spending more than a half of their income on rent. And so that's where for some of your political leaders, I would do 2 things. The first is I would start bringing out a wealth of people with this experience, with this lived experience. And these are go to their voters. If in Delaware you have districts, find people in the districts of whoever the legislators are that you are trying to reach, and get those base people to come out and say, I care about this. Let me tell you, I lost my job last year and I was worried I was going to lose my house. I was worried I was going to end up on the street. Or I got really sick and I ended up, I couldn't afford my rent anymore. I ended up having to move in with my mom. Or living in my car for 3 months. You need to find those folks. You need to find the base and activate them so that they can come out and be loud voices. And then you can be able to say to your legislators, you just heard from 3 of your constituents. And guess what? They're not the only ones. We've seen so much where folks are feeling XYZ, and we've got this in reams of data that we can share with you if you need it. And this is actually how you can combine the personal story to our data and research, right? It's a really powerful way to do that. So thank you, Mike, for that question.
Thank you. While we're on Michael's, one other question you had was about when you were talking about audiences. Anything about where parents with adult children still living at home might fall in those different audience groups?
Base. They are part of the base. We are finding that they are the people that we have to mobilize, right? So those inactive supporters. They support us, they are with us, yes. And then they don't come out to talk with the legislators, or they don't come out to engage in whatever actions it is that you all are kind of moving and working toward. And so they fall into the base. So thank you, Michael. And parents, I would say parents in general, right? Because there is a whole element around parents with children, particularly, we know that the group that has the highest rates of evictions are single mothers, especially Black and brown moms, especially Black moms. And so parents generally also fall into this category.
Thank you. There was a question from Pamela about that says, given that people traditionally live with family, can you share any root cause research on the housing crisis as an outgrowth of the family crisis? I'm not sure if you that I don't know if
Tell me a
Pamela is
little more.
still here and wants to clarify that question a bit, but I wanted to share that one.
Yeah, that'd be great if Pamela could maybe
I do see
expand.
Pamela
Mhm.
still here. Do you want to clarify, Pamela, or provide more context?
Um, I was hoping you could do that with some research sources, but if not, I'll look elsewhere.
And maybe just
Um,
Pamela, if you can, when you mentioned the family crisis, do you mean like the affordability crisis? Is that what you are referencing? Or um the challenges that families are having making ends meet? I just wanted that little piece of clarification. Is that what you meant, Pamela?
I'm looking for what the research means. I do know that people aren't living with their families if they're a broader family, not just, parents and children who don't have stable housing. But yeah, I understand. I guess it's a new question. I'll do some research on it.
Well, and we're certainly finding, Pamela, that the affordability piece is really challenging. It's really challenging for young people. We are seeing young people, particularly with in households that have in some fashion receive public funding. There are limits to how many adults can be in a house, right? What the adults do. So there we are seeing families. It's a very little spoken about concern and issue that families that are often receiving some kind of federal assistance, right, can only have a certain number of adults in the home. And it may mean that there are adult children who may be turning adults like in some kind of concession or secession, excuse me, who may have to leave the house at 18, right? And not for any personal failing of the family, but because their lease says you can only have two or three adults in the house. And, I don't know what world any of us are living in, but, when my 18-year-old was 18, there was no way that they were going to be able to manage living on their own. It was just not a thing, right? And so there are unique circumstances that are affecting our families that are struggling to get by. Certainly, the affordability issue is affecting every family at almost, every sort of level from the middle income on down, especially. So those are definitely some really key areas for that families are facing, and it ends up right having some pretty big impacts on their children.
Um, Thank you. I hope that was helpful, Pamela. Regina asked for a list of buzzwords. The words you are using are great. And I think
Oh,
she and maybe some of us would love just a list of them. Um, Maybe that's coming. But can you speak to that a little bit?
I will. And you know what? I will share. We actually have a whole chart
Mhm.
of words to replace and embrace that actually is not on this deck. But before we share the deck out with you, I will make sure that I include that for Sonia and Rachel to then share out with all of you. And what I will say about the words, right, is that they are words that resonate with folks. They resonate with different audiences because it's not just what you say, it's what people hear, right? Remember that idea of like it's for the receiver, not the giver. And so when we talk in certain ways, it's what resonates most. The language that we use is really meant to resonate with the receiver. So we will share that with all of you that you can, excuse me, that you can start to incorporate in your everyday um, speeches and writing and those kinds of things.
Awesome, thank you. And then Jim asked, has anyone generated data around how the cost to society would go down if homelessness was eliminated? I know there have been some studies broadly on that, but Marisol, I don't know if you want to point to anything in particular.
I don't have anything right off the top of my head, but for sure, organizations like the Low Income Housing Coalition actually has done, they did some big research within the last year about how our communities are hurt because of the huge gap in affordable housing. And especially especially affordable housing for people that are very low income. And then I believe the Brookings Institute has done something also very similar, but I'm drawing a little bit of a blank on the specifics of those. So I will point you in the direction of both of those organizations. And then the Harvard research that I pointed to earlier about the households and how I want to say that if I remember the data correctly, again, it's been within the last year. I want to say that it was maybe half of the households were paying more than half of their income, but do not quote me on that because I it could be like a third paying a half or something like that. But I urge you to also look at some of the work that Harvard has done. And the Harvard has a school division that is all about child development, that is also looking at this question from the perspective of how important stable housing is for a child to have in their development, especially their 0 to 5 years.
Thank you. Those are all the
Okay.
questions in the chat. So I think we can move on to the next part.
All right. So what I'm going to do, we would love to break you all up into small group discussions where you are going to think about some of the narrative road mapping and the narrative recommendations and really think about like, what are you doing in your work and what do you want to do more in your work, right? So thinking about how we have discussed, right, some of the kind of key pieces. What are you doing right now? And then what do you want to do? So I'm going to put the question in the chat, and then Dustin is going to break us out into some small groups for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and have the conversation on do a little check-in afterwards, right? So I'll put the question in the chat, and then Dustin, um do you want to start to break us off into break folks up into groups, and I'll put the questions here for you.
Yeah, I think I hit a wrong button. I got sent back here instead of staying in room 7.
Let me see. Oh, that is weird.
Oh, I probably hit something wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, because I can see that you were, and it's not actually
Yeah, I
letting
was
me.
there.
Yeah, it won't let me send you back. It's a glitch.
Sorry about that.
No, no worries. Let me see if I can put you in another room that has a couple of people because we might need to even out the numbers. Let me see. Room 3. Okay.
Yeah, I think I got dropped out of a room as well.
Michael, you should. Yep. Um, Lauren.
Hi, there was no discussion in my group. Can I be put in another group?
Yeah, sure. Let me put you into another group.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
think some of the breakout rooms are still talking, so hopefully people will be joining us in a second.
All right. Wonderful. We're all back. So maybe we do a little report back, some of the conversations for our last 5 minutes that you all were having. Some of the places where you felt like, huh, this is what we're doing with narrative, and no, not so much. I'd like to jump in.
Hey, Steve, your box light up. That means you have to talk.
Okay. All right, I'll talk. Well, it was Ann and I and Sam Leland, Ann Cook and Sam Leland and I. I guess we were expecting to be more people coming in, so we kind of were silent for a minute or two and then got in and then missed the question. So Sam disappeared, so it's me and Ann, and we more or less got acquainted and talked about just kind of traded notes. So it was great. It was good meeting her. We both were working at the VA for a while and kind of traded things back and forth and how Sussex County is a good place to run into the I forgot the exact name, like the oppositional folks and how and Ann's got a good way of approaching them in different areas. So kind of talked. It's most of what we talked about. So it was good, but probably not exactly going with the program.
That's okay. We like not to always go with the program. That's wonderful. Anne, would you like to jump in about how you talk to the opposition? Is Anne still here?
I don't know. I'm going to put myself on blast because I'm retired and I was telling Stephen that I play a lot of pickleball. So I have a lot of time waiting for games with the opposition. And sometimes I wear t-shirts that kind of might trigger a little bit of conversation. Like I have a YIMBY t-shirt that I wear and we talk about affordable housing and try to keep it pretty light actually. But just once, and I'm usually hit with the same things. It's interesting. I'm hit with a lot of the same kind of negative narratives that you'd find in other places about how well they're spending all their money on drugs and and just kind of just and I'm lucky to have spent a lot of time with with older veterans. Is a lot of time was what was on my caseload, so I could share some of the stories with older veterans. I could talk about sometimes. I could also kind of insert some conversations about how well you might not have thought of this, but some of the behaviors that you see might be neurocognitive for some of the older people. We see it, but there are a lot of people living with dementia on the streets. And just kind of trying to show that face of the people that they might be seeing. That's not some of that behavior isn't what you think it is, and a lot of people just lose their people. A lot of people I like to say this, a lot of older men are case managed by women. And when that case manager, their wives, in other words, and when that person passes away, they find themselves very vulnerable
Yeah,
and lost.
that's right.
So just trying to maybe let them see that it could be them at some point.
I love that. And Anne, it's a real world example of like what we see with the research, right? Which is that telling these personal stories, especially to persuadables and the group that is least likely to be persuaded, helping them kind of understand that from a real lived experience perspective actually does open their minds around it a little bit more, right? You also have the added shared value of pickleball. It is a safe place. It is chill. It is easy. It is not confrontational, and no one's going to be on their guard, right? Nobody's coming in saying, you're going to call me XYZ because I don't agree with you. We're here to hit the wiffle ball with with the racket. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Ann and Stephen. Anyone else in our last 2 minutes? Kimberly, I see that you are off mute. Is that because you or Lauren, folks, maybe I'm just going to look at some folks that maybe are off mute. Do either of you would like to jump in?
I was just off mute because I didn't mute myself after we came back.
Well, would you like to jump in now?
I would just say that we had a very small group as well, but we were talking just a little bit about kind of the words permanent supportive housing and how we throw that around so much, or I have personally thrown that around and often felt a little frustrated that people didn't quite understand what I was trying to get at, that it it sounded intrusive to some people and it sounded way too permanent to other people, and and that safe stable housing says it all, and in a much less offensive way.
Right, like it doesn't trigger as much,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
In people's minds. That's great. And I will, when we get off, like I mentioned, I will make sure to include our words to replace and embrace that will be helpful for you all. And I'm looking at the time. Thank you, Kimberly, so much for jumping in. I'm gonna turn it all back over to Sonia to wrap us up. Thank you all so very much. I just enjoyed my time with all of you today. And Sonia, take it away. Thank you.
Saying thank you always feels less than. You are an amazing gift, and everything you shared are things that we can learn from and do so much better with. I would not be good at my job if I didn't share some really, really quick next steps. So I'm going to ask some of you just to stay on for 2 more minutes. I know we're running a few minutes over, but I'll make it as quick as possible. Rachel, if you could just show this next step slide. There's some concrete things we need your help with. One of which is Homes Campaign has put together a letter campaign in support of HB 135, the Homeless Bill of Rights. We need people to sign on individually. Well, this is an organizational one. So please, please, if you are part of an organization, get them to sign on. 2, we need to be sending emails now to our legislators about HB 135, telling them that they need to support this bill. Tell them they need to have a hearing for this bill, never mind support it, and they need a vote on it. We cannot do mass emails anymore. I have been telling people this. Now we have verifiable proof. They don't read them. They delete them. So we have to actually do the work and send them a real email. If you want some more education about the Dr. Deborah Gilbert White Act, you can find that language there. And finally, my own personal plug, become a housing advocate. I know many of you get my emails, but there's some new people on this call, and it is the best way that I can let you know when there are hearings, when I activate you to do stuff. Stop sharing. Thank you. What I took away, I took a lot of things away. One is I say the word not way too much. But second to that, what I took away is that I speak to those who I am comfortable speaking with too much. So I need to find more ways to talk to persuadables. I need to find more ways to get out to those people who aren't already there, but could be. And I need your help in doing that. So if you are in a place of worship, if you go to Rotary, if you have a bowling club, if you have a book club, anything where people get together who aren't there because they are defined politically aligned, but are interested in hearing more about the issue, bring me in. Because I need to do my work to strengthen that muscle to reach out to more persuadables, because we have to build our base. So thank you, Marisol. Thank you, thank you, thank you to everybody who stayed to the end. I know that breakout rooms can be tricky for Delawareans. I'm working on that. But I know our group was interesting, and I hope everybody's was as well. The webinar, as always, was wonderful. So thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.